This might sound a little strange, but bear with me. Back when I was in high school, there was this kid who went around telling everyone he was a demon. I don't even feel comfortable writing his name, and soon you'll understand why. For now, let's just call him Patrick, even though his actual name sounded like something from a Shakespeare play. Patrick was extremely socially awkward and had this totally blank stare that made even teachers feel uneasy. He wore the same plain gray hoodie every single day. I'm serious, it was like he never washed it because he always smelled awful. He wasn't tall, just average looking, but it was hard to tell since he always had his hood up and never took off his sunglasses, even indoor. Teachers eventually stopped asking him to remove them because he never listened anyway. Then, things started getting weird. He didn't have any friends, but he had this strange habit of adopting people. If he liked you, decided at random really, he'd walk up to you and say, "You're adopted," which meant you were part of his circle, or whatever he considered it. Supposedly, this meant he'd protect you from him or something. At least, that's what he'd say. He didn't adopt many people, though, and most of us didn't buy into his whole demon act. We just figured he was a troubled kid, which he definitely was. Oh, and I should mention, all this took place in Wayne, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. One of my friends, Gabby, had also been adopted by him, and Patrick's crush on her was way more obvious. Everyone in our friend group knew about it. One day, my friends and I were hanging out on the dugouts behind our high school, just killing time. It was me, Gabby, Laura, and Luke. Somehow, the conversation shifted to Patrick's crush on Gabby. We were all laughing, and Gabby was obviously a little embarrassed. We usually had a nickname we'd use for Patrick because his real name was just too much. But this time, Laura actually used his real name. By the third time she said it, I swear, Patrick appeared out of nowhere, standing on top of the dugout with a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't scary in the usual sense, but it was definitely one of the most unsettling things I'd ever experienced. We immediately stopped talking, nervous that he'd overheard us. He didn't say a word, just stared at us. I gave a little wave, and he nodded in acknowledgement before jumping back down and walking away. Once we were sure he was gone, we all burst into laughter. It was such a weird encounter, but honestly, I was still a little freaked out. The next incident was even creepier, and definitely not something we could laugh off. I was hanging out at Laura's house, just the two of us in her room, and her parents were home. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about, but once again, Patrick's name came up 3 times between the two of us. Not even 10 minutes later, we heard Laura's front door slam shut. Confused, we went downstairs to see if one of our friends had stopped by. Laura's house was kind of like the hangout spot, so people would drop by unannounced all the time. But when we got to the living room, we saw Patrick just standing there, casually talking to Laura's mom. She asked him what he was doing there, and he literally replied, "I was summoned." Laura's mom made some small talk with him before politely asking him to leave, which he did, silently. The only reason alarm bells didn't immediately go off was because Laura's mom actually knew Patrick and pitied him. But Laura and I were definitely not calm about it. As we went back upstairs, we just looked at each other in horror, both silently freaking out over how creepy the whole thing was. A few minutes later, we finally put 2 and 2 together. Patrick seemed to pop up whenever his name was said 3 times. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but we'd both seen 2 unexplainable events and knew all about Patrick's "I'm a demon" story. How else were we supposed to make sense of it? The next day, we told our entire friend group what had happened, and from that point on, we all swore never to say his name 3 times in a row. For a few months, things were fine, and I was starting to think maybe I'd overreacted. That was until one day when my friends and I were hanging out at our friend Johnny's house, just chilling on his back deck. Somehow, the conversation turned to Patrick again. Despite all of us warning him, Johnny refused to believe our story. Even after the whole group backed me up, he was still skeptical. To prove his point, he jokingly used Patrick's name 3 times in the same sentence. When nothing happened, he smirked and told us we were ridiculous for believing it. As annoyed as I was, part of me was honestly relieved that nothing had happened. But I spoke too soon. A few minutes later, Patrick appeared, jumping over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny saw him first and went silent mid-sentence. We all followed suit, completely tense, as Patrick stared at us for a few seconds before hopping back over the fence and vanishing. Johnny started freaking out, accusing us of teaming up with Patrick to scare him. We told him we'd begged him not to say anything. Eventually, he told us all to go home, clearly shaken. The last encounter I had with Patrick was by far the scariest, and the one time I actually felt like my life could be in danger. A few months after the incident at Johnny's house, I was home alone one night, a rare thing back then, since my parents hardly ever went out. I decided to take advantage of the situation and invited over a guy I'd been talking to. He was kind of a rebel, but so were most of the guys I hung out with at that age. It was lightly raining outside, and we were just hanging out in my room. After a while, he mentioned something about Patrick, which made me visibly cringe. He got confused, so I explained the situation to him. He laughed and said he'd say Patrick's name to scare me. I begged him not to, but he did it anyway. Only this time, he actually screamed Patrick's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. There was no delay this time. As soon as he finished, I could hear the rain start to pour outside, followed by a flash of lightning a few seconds later. I started to panic, and the guy I was with actually looked sorry, telling me it was probably just a crazy coincidence. I cursed him out and ran to the window to look at the storm, and when I glanced down at the driveway, I screamed. There was a silhouette of someone standing there, looking up at my window. It was too dark and rainy to see clearly, but I was 99% sure it was Patrick. I shut the blinds and ran downstairs, frantically locking every door. After securing the back door, I looked outside again, and there he was, just standing still in my front yard. I could feel a panic attack coming on, convinced Patrick was going to find a way inside. I started screaming, "I'm adopted," over and over, hoping it might help somehow. I knew there was no way he could hear me, but I was panicking. The guy I'd invited over came downstairs a few seconds later and tried to comfort me. I looked out the window one last time, and he was gone, but the storm was still raging. I didn't dare go out to check, though. The next morning, after my friend had left, I went outside to check the yard. In the far corner of my backyard, I found something that horrified me. It was Patrick's hoodie, wrapped around a few of my belongings that I thought I'd lost. My parents were still out, and I was too scared to call the police. I figured I'd show my parents when they got back, and they'd handle it, but I never had to, because Patrick never came back to school after that. None of us ever saw him again, and no one knew what happened to him. To this day, my parents still live in that house, and I think about it a lot. I know this isn't a typical horror story, but I don't really know where else to get this off my chest. Some people from school later told me they'd caught Patrick hiding and eavesdropping on their conversations, which might explain how he always managed to show up out of nowhere. As I've gotten older, I think the most likely explanation is that Patrick was just a troubled, possibly mentally ill stalker who followed me and maybe other girls around. The idea that he could have been listening to me or tracking me everywhere still creeps me out to this day, and I don't even want to wonder where he is now. I quickly pulled out of the parking lot, and we were back on our way. The snow was falling even heavier now, covering the roads in a thick blanket. The drive to the party was supposed to be simple, just 20 or 30 minutes through familiar suburban neighborhoods, but things in my life never go as planned. The snowstorm turned what should have been an easy drive into a tense and dangerous journey. Just so you know, I'm not exactly a great driver to begin with, and the car slipping every few seconds didn't make things any easier. After navigating a tricky uphill stretch, I turned a corner and saw something no one ever wants to see. A car stopped right in the middle of the road, its hazard lights flashing, cutting through the snowfall like warning signals. Both the driver's and passenger's side doors were wide open. I wanted to just drive around it and keep going, but Mike insisted we stop. Call me cautious, but I'm not the good Samaritan type. I've been through enough to be wary of strangers. I told him we were already late, but he urged me to pull over with a serious tone. Mike's curiosity had led us into trouble before, but this felt different. Someone might actually need help. Reluctantly, I stopped the car, and the two of us just sat there in silence for a moment. Mike suggested we check it out, to which I responded, "That's what we're doing." He rolled his eyes, pointing out that watching the car from inside ours wasn't going to accomplish anything. Fair point, but I really didn't want to get out, so I asked him to wait a few more minutes. He agreed, though reluctantly. We sat there, watching the eerie blink of the hazards against the quiet, snow-covered backdrop, but nothing happened. Finally, Mike said he'd had enough and was going to go investigate. Before I could stop him, he was out of the car. As he approached the vehicle, I felt a growing sense of unease, and I could have sworn I saw something dark move out of the corner of my eye. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but with every passing second, this situation felt worse. About 10 seconds later, I thought I saw the car jolt slightly, like something had shifted in the back seat or trunk. I wasn't waiting around to find out. I slammed my hand on the horn, startling Mike, who quickly looked back and understood the message. He sprinted back to the car, and I drove off right away. I explained my suspicion that the whole thing could have been a setup. He was annoyed, pointing out that I didn't have any real proof, but I told him flatly that I wasn't going to risk my life for someone who could easily call for help. The rest of the drive was tense. Mike can hold a grudge, and he wasn't happy about the way I'd handled things. When we finally arrived at the dinner party, things started to feel normal again. We spent a few hours catching up with old friends, and both of us had nearly forgotten about what had happened. Just as some guests were getting ready to leave, our host turned on the TV for a weather update on the snowstorm. He switched to the local news, and what I saw there chilled me. Police were reporting a carjacking that had happened just a couple of hours earlier, involving a setup eerily similar to what we'd seen. According to the victim, a woman was driving her teenage son home when she saw a car in the middle of the road with its hazards on and doors open. As they approached to check if someone needed help, two men leapt out from behind a snowbank, and another man came out of the trunk, holding them at gunpoint. They stole her car and sped off with it, leaving the setup car behind. I turned to Mike, my face full of fear. That could have been us. We told everyone at the party what we'd witnessed earlier, which quickly put a damper on the mood. But people couldn't get enough of the story. The worst part about the whole experience is that it's only made me even more distrustful of strangers than I already was. I can't help but wonder how many people I would have helped in a time of need if I hadn't been so shaken by this meticulous trap. Uncle Joseph was a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, the one person I often turned to when I needed help. He probably knew more about me than my own parents did. I trusted him completely and shared things with him that I wouldn't tell anyone else. That summer, though, I began having disturbing, graphic nightmares. They weren't centered on any particular theme, but each one involved something deeply distressing. Losing family members, being alone forever, things like that. Most of the details have faded from my memory, but there's one nightmare I'll never forget. In that nightmare, I woke up and went downstairs to join my parents for breakfast, just like any normal day. But when I got to the kitchen, they weren't there, and there was no food on the table. I ran through the house, checking every room, my parents, my siblings, but the house was empty. I sat down in my bedroom, crying, wondering why everyone had left me. After 3 or 4 nights of similar nightmares, I finally went to Uncle Joseph, too embarrassed to tell my parents. He listened carefully, looking more concerned as I went on, jotting notes in his little notebook. He told me I should try to dig deeper, to reflect on what might be causing these dreams, but I was only 10. I didn't know how to go about that. A few days and more nightmares later, I went back to him. He said he'd given it some thought and had figured out what was going on in my mind. He told me that even though I didn't consciously think so, I must be frustrated with my parents and that I was harboring unresolved anger towards them. I remember feeling so confused. I was polite, well-behaved, and loved my parents deeply, but Uncle Joseph was the expert. I trusted that he knew what he was talking about. When I asked what to do, he suggested that I should be slightly more disobedient, try saying no more often, maybe argue a bit when things didn't go my way. He assured me this was part of dealing with the emotions he said I was struggling with. So, for the next 3 days, I did as he'd suggested, acting out in ways that were so unlike me that my parents grew worried and told me I needed to stop. I hated upsetting them, but I was willing to do anything to end those nightmares. Yet, they only got worse, more vivid, more terrifying each night. Desperate, I confided in Uncle Joseph again. This time, he hesitated before finally telling me there was one more thing we could try. I begged him to explain, and after some convincing, he said that my mind was too mature for my young body and that it needed to be set free. I had no idea what he meant, but I didn't press. That night, I went to bed feeling terrified. I didn't know what setting my mind free meant, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, though, I woke up suddenly before a nightmare could even start. I lay there, feeling frozen in fear, staring at the wall. Then, right next to my ear, I heard a whisper, Uncle Joseph's voice. I turned over and screamed, and he shot back, leaving my room quickly and closing the door behind him. I sat in my bed, unsure if I was still dreaming. I ran straight to my parents and told them everything about the nightmares, what Uncle Joseph had been telling me, and what had just happened. My dad didn't waste a second. He stormed into Uncle Joseph's room and confronted him. Uncle Joseph denied everything, but my dad, being a big guy, was intimidating, and they started fighting. During the struggle, my dad grabbed the satchel Uncle Joseph always carried. Uncle Joseph gathered up his things and left, practically running out of the house. My dad opened the satchel, and what he found inside was horrifying. Pages of notes and printed articles, all related to dreams, specifically nightmares. There were notes about inducing nightmares, different techniques, personal data, and disturbing details from previous experiments. It was nauseating. The police were called, and they discovered even more disturbing evidence on his computer. I don't need to go into detail, but it was enough to confirm what he'd meant by wanting to set my body free. I never saw him again. My parents don't like to talk about what happened, and I try not to bring it up. Sometimes I kick myself for being so naive, but there's nothing I can do about it now. Okay guys, thanks for watching this video till the end.